The bedding aisle was quiet, and for a while, it felt like any ordinary shopping trip. My father trusted us enough to let us explore on our own, but we always had our walkie-talkies just in case. I loved that feeling of independence, even though I was just a kid. It made me feel grown up, like I could handle anything. But Walmart can feel huge when you're alone. A maze of aisles stretching in every direction, filled with strangers who all seemed busy with their own lives. I didn't think much of it at first. Why would I? It was just another store, another day. I wandered further into the section, lost in my thoughts, enjoying the quiet. That's when the uneasiness started to set in. Something wasn't right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. It was subtle at first, like the air had shifted. A tension, a heaviness that made my skin crawl. I glanced around, but everything seemed normal. Still, that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. I decided it was time to move on, hoping the strange feeling would pass. I clutched the walkie-talkie in my hand and made my way toward the pet section. My father was just a call away, and that thought gave me a small sense of relief. I pressed the button and asked, "Dad, where are you?" But there was no response. Static filled the line, and my heart sank. Trying to stay calm, I kept walking, sticking close to other shoppers. The sight of someone else in the aisle gave me a bit of comfort. For a moment, I convinced myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe the man wasn't really staring at me. Maybe it was all in my head. But just as I let out a breath, I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again. The same man. He was walking by the end of the aisle, slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to be seen. My stomach twisted. This wasn't my imagination. He was following me. Panic started to set in. I gripped the walkie-talkie tighter and asked again, "Dad, where are you?" Still nothing. The silence from the other end felt louder than anything around me. I knew I couldn't just stand there, so I made a quick decision to head toward the front of the store where the customer service desk was. But as I started walking, I noticed him again. He wasn't far behind me, matching my steps. Each time I turned a corner, he would appear, keeping the same slow, steady pace. My heart raced as I tried to think of a way to lose him. Every direction I took, he seemed to block the way. I could feel his presence growing closer, and every second felt heavier. I knew I had to act fast before things got worse. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to think quickly. In my 10-year-old logic, the bathroom felt like the safest place to hide. I turned sharply and sprinted toward it, not daring to look back. The moment I pushed the door open, I darted into a stall and locked it behind me, trying to steady my breathing. The restroom was eerily silent, but my heart was pounding so loudly it echoed in my ears. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps broke through the quiet. He had followed me in. My eyes shot to the floor, and I saw his shoes stop just outside my stall. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen, praying he would leave. But he didn't move. The fear was overwhelming, and I felt trapped with nowhere to run. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a voice broke through the tension. It was a woman, her tone sharp and angry. "Hey, get out of here," she yelled. I saw his shoes hesitate for a moment, then retreat. Relief washed over me, but I still couldn't move. The woman knocked on the store door softly and asked, "Are you okay in there?" Her voice was kind now, and it gave me the courage to open the door. The moment I saw her, I burst into tears and hugged her tightly. She held my hand and told me everything was going to be all right. I told her what happened as she led me toward the customer service desk, staying by my side the entire time. I finally felt safe again. At the customer service desk, the woman stayed close, making sure I wasn't alone. She explained everything to the staff, and soon my father arrived. I ran to him, still shaken, and told him everything that had happened. The woman backed up my story, assuring him it was all true. But my father didn't believe me. He shrugged it off, saying I was probably overreacting or misunderstood the situation. His disbelief hurt, but I couldn't focus on that. The fear I had felt was real, and the memory of the man's cold stare stayed with me. Even as we left the store and the woman waved goodbye, I knew I would never forget what happened that day. Even after leaving the store, the experience stayed with me, replaying in my mind over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being followed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his shoes under the store door, and the way he had silently matched my steps. I kept asking myself, what if the woman hadn't been there? What if no one had come to help? The thought made my stomach twist. That moment changed something in me. I realized how quickly a normal day could turn into a nightmare, and how even a place that felt safe could suddenly become terrifying. It was a lesson I never wanted to learn, but it's one I've carried with me ever since. After that day, I couldn't walk into a store without feeling uneasy. Every stranger's glance felt suspicious. Every shadow made me tense up. It wasn't just fear, it was the constant awareness that something like this could happen again. I started staying closer to my family when we went out, never wandering off like I used to. Even though my father dismissed what happened, I couldn't forget it. The fear was too real, and the memory too vivid. I learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to that strange feeling when something didn't seem right. Because in that moment, it wasn't just a feeling, it was a warning that saved me. I turned to see what had caught her attention, and that's when I noticed him. A man, standing about 20 feet away, staring at my daughter. He looked ordinary at first, middle-aged, short, and chubby, but there was something off. His gaze was too intense, too focused on her. My daughter was used to people admiring her because of her bright, cheerful face, but this was different. It wasn't kind or casual. It made my stomach turn. I tried to shake it off, moving to the grocery section and hoping the man would disappear into the crowd. But that uneasy feeling lingered. My daughter might not have understood what she was seeing, but she knew something was wrong. And so did I. As I moved through the aisles, I decided to call my friend back. We had a silent signal, 3 quick buzzes on our bond bracelets whenever I needed him urgently. Within minutes, he was at my side. His presence calmed me, but when I casually mentioned the man, his expression grew serious. "I noticed him earlier," my friend said quietly. "He was following you when you were heading to the pharmacy." That single sentence sent a chill down my spine. If my friend had noticed him too, it wasn't just in my head. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something was very wrong. We continued shopping, but now I was on high alert. Every turn of the cart felt heavier, every glance over my shoulder more urgent. Then it happened again. My daughter's small voice broke the tension. This time, she said, "Santa." Confused, I turned around, and there he was holding a large Santa mask over his face, standing just a few feet away. He waved at my kids as if it was some kind of joke. But there was nothing funny about it. My heart raced, and I grabbed the cart, pushing it toward the front of the store. My friend stayed close, his eyes scanning the aisles for the man. All I could think was to get out of there as quickly as possible, but he wasn't making it easy. Every step felt slower, like the store was growing longer with each passing moment. As we approached the checkout lanes, I tried to act calm for the kids, but my hands were shaking. I spotted an empty lane and rushed to unload the items, hoping this would finally be the end of it. But when I glanced up, there he was again. This time, he was standing by the grocery exit, just watching us. The cashier noticed how unsettled I looked and asked if everything was okay. I quickly explained the situation, keeping my voice low. She nodded and called for a manager while continuing to scan my groceries. My friend was standing guard now, his tall frame blocking the man's line of sight. It gave me a little comfort, but I knew we weren't safe yet. We had to get out of there before things escalated further. We finally made it out of the checkout lane, but as we stepped outside, the fear came rushing back. He was there again, waiting near the parking lot, his eyes fixed on us. This time, he didn't even try to hide it. He looked straight at my toddler, smiling in a way that sent shivers down my spine. Before I could react, my friend stepped forward, his posture tall and intimidating. "Back off," he roared, his voice echoing in the cold air. The man froze for a moment, then backed away, startled. It was enough to give us time to load the kids and groceries into the car. My hands fumbled with the seat belts as my friend kept watch, his eyes never leaving the man. All I wanted was to get my kids out of there and as far away from him as possible. As we hurried to finish loading the car, I saw the store manager and a couple of employees walking toward the man. They were talking to him, their expressions serious. I didn't stay to watch what happened next. My only goal was to leave and get my children somewhere safe. My friend buckled the kids into their seats while I threw the last of the groceries into the trunk. We drove off quickly, my heart still pounding. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the man standing there, now surrounded by the employees. The sight didn't bring relief, only more questions. Who was he? What did he want? And why us? All I could do was keep driving, trying to leave the fear behind with each passing mile. Even after we got home, the fear lingered. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head, wondering what would have happened if my friend hadn't been there. The man's face, his creepy smile, and the way he seemed to target my daughter, it all stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe he wasn't dangerous, that perhaps he was just unwell. But the way he followed us, the way he kept appearing no matter where we went, made it impossible to believe that. I was grateful for my friend's quick actions and the help from the store employees, but deep down, I knew I had to be more cautious from now on. That day changed how I looked at the world, and I realized just how quickly things can take a dark turn. The incident stayed with me long after it was over. Every time I entered a store, I found myself scanning the aisles, looking over my shoulder, and holding my kids a little closer. I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest, a constant reminder of how vulnerable we had been. I also thought about how I froze at first, unsure of what to do. It made me realize how important it is to trust your instincts and act quickly. That man might have had his reasons, but those reasons didn't matter. What mattered was keeping my kids safe, no matter what. From that day on, I promised myself I'd never let fear stop me from protecting them again. The jewelry department was tucked into a corner of the store, away from the busiest sections. Most nights, I spent hours organizing the displays and locking up expensive items before the store quieted down. The counters had only one opening, which meant I had to be careful about keeping it clear in case I needed to leave quickly. Even though there were other employees working late, it often felt like I was completely alone. The sounds of distant footsteps or carts rolling by would echo through the empty aisles, but no one ever came close unless they needed something. I told myself it was just another part of the job, but sometimes the isolation made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Little did I know, that uneasy feeling was just the beginning. It started innocently enough. A man, probably in his 50s, began walking by my counter on the nights I worked. He always said the same thing. Hi. At first, I thought nothing of it. He didn't linger or try to strike up a conversation. I'd glance up, smile politely, and return the greeting before going back to my work. But then he kept coming back. Every night, around the same time, he'd appear. His presence became so regular that I started to expect it, almost like clockwork. I didn't know his name, and he never asked mine. It seemed harmless at first, just another customer passing through. I had no idea how wrong I was. Things took a strange turn on my birthday. A few co-workers had surprised me with a small cake during my shift, and we shared a quick celebration before getting back to work. Later that evening, the man showed up again. This time he didn't just say hi. Instead, he handed a card to my manager and asked her to give it to me. At first, my manager and I laughed it off, thinking it was just a harmless gesture. But when I opened the card, my stomach dropped. Inside, he had written about seeing me hug my coworkers earlier and how it made him upset. He wrote that he didn't want me hugging anyone else, only him. The playful atmosphere from earlier disappeared, replaced by an unsettling tension. This wasn't harmless anymore, it was personal. A week later, he came back, but this time he didn't say a word. Instead, he dropped a thick envelope on my counter and walked away. I didn't open it right away, but when I finally did, my hands started to shake. Inside was 6 pages, written front and back, filled with his life story. He wrote about his family, schools he attended, and bizarre things like his sister's supposed psychic powers and his father being an exorcist. The letter took an even darker turn when he described dreams about a missing 18-month-old girl calling out his name. He claimed he could feel her pain and knew she was in danger. It was unsettling, to say the least. This was no longer a friendly customer with a harmless crush. This was something far more disturbing. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took the letter straight to my manager, who read it with a serious expression. He told me to file a written complaint and assured me he would speak to the man. I felt a little better knowing someone was taking it seriously, but I was still on edge. My manager advised me not to go outside alone during breaks and to avoid areas where the man might be. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. I didn't see him, and I hoped the situation was over. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. I tried to focus on my work and stick to the rules my manager gave me, but every sound or shadow near the counter made my heart race. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid, and I was right to be. One night, as I was closing up the jewelry department, he returned. This time, he pushed a handcart full of boxes toward the counter. At first, I didn't think much of it until he deliberately shoved the cart into the only opening of the counter, blocking my way out. My chest tightened as I realized I was trapped. He stood there, staring at me, his silence more terrifying than words. Then, leaning slightly closer, he whispered, "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." His tone was calm, almost friendly, but his expression said otherwise. It was predatory, cold. I tried to stay composed, acting like I wasn't shaken, and continued my closing tasks. But inside, every nerve was screaming for me to get away. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask, "Weren't you told to stay away from me?" His face twisted into a grin that made my stomach turn. "The manager asked if I was joking," he said, his voice low. I told him I was, but I'm not. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me frozen in place, too scared to move. After that night, It only got worse. He started showing up everywhere, not just at work, but outside of it too. I'd see him at the mall, at the grocery store, even in places I went to relax. It felt like he was always one step behind me, watching. I couldn't escape him, no matter how hard I tried. Other employees began sharing stories about him too. I found out that several people had reported him for similar behavior over the past couple of years. Somehow, nothing had ever been done to stop him. Knowing I wasn't the only one he had targeted made it even more unsettling. It wasn't just about me, it was a pattern. Each encounter added to my fear, making it harder to feel safe anywhere. Looking back, that experience changed me. I learned how quickly a situation could spiral out of control, how a seemingly harmless person could turn into a threat. It made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I stopped brushing off my instincts, realizing they often knew something I didn't. Even now, the memory lingers. The fear, the helplessness, and the sense of being watched, it's something I'll never forget. I wish I had spoken up sooner or pushed harder for action, but at the time, I didn't know what else to do. It taught me a hard lesson. You can't always count on others to protect you, so you have to protect yourself. The store was quiet inside, with only a few shoppers scattered in the aisles. I moved quickly, grabbing the essentials from my list, but that strange feeling from the parking lot stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of the gray sedan circling, its slow, deliberate movements playing over in my mind. I tried to focus on shopping, telling myself it was just paranoia. After all, nothing had happened. But even as I filled my cart, a small part of me couldn't relax. The thought of that car lurking outside stuck with me, a nagging unease I couldn't ignore. I finished my shopping and headed back to the parking lot. The air was cooler now, and the quiet felt heavier. As I approached my car, everything seemed normal until I glanced up. The grey sedan was still there, slowly circling, its headlights catching the edges of the lot. My stomach tightened, but I tried to stay calm. I loaded my groceries into the trunk, glancing around to make sure no one was nearby. That's when the uneasy feeling became something stronger, almost like a warning. Without thinking, I climbed into the driver's seat and immediately locked all the doors. A second later, I saw the car speed up and turn in my direction. It stopped abruptly, partially blocking my path. The man in the sedan rolled down his window, leaning slightly out as he yelled something I couldn't fully hear. His voice was sharp, demanding, but what struck me more was his body language. His hands stayed in his pockets the whole time, never coming out, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Was he hiding something? I rolled my window down just an inch, enough to hear him better, but not enough to make me vulnerable. "What do you need?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He replied in a raised voice, saying he needed help and asking me to open my door. My instincts were screaming at me now, whatever he wanted. It wasn't help. My hand shifted to the gear, ready to reverse if I needed to. As I sat frozen, trying to figure out my next move, he suddenly stepped out of his car. My heart started racing as I saw him approach, his hands still buried deep in his pockets. He reached for my door handle and pulled on it, yelling for me to open up. My instincts kicked in, and I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away from him. He stumbled slightly, caught off guard, but kept shouting something I couldn't make out. Without looking back, I shifted into drive and sped out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they hurt. I didn't stop, didn't breathe, until I was far from the store and out of his sight. Once I felt far enough away, I pulled into a brightly lit, crowded parking lot. My hands were still shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. I explained everything: how the car had been circling, how the man had blocked my path, and how he tried to open my door. The dispatcher listened carefully and assured me they'd send someone to investigate. I stayed there, parked under the bright lights, waiting for my heartbeat to slow. The dispatcher told me the police would check the area, but part of me already knew he would be gone. People like that don't stick around. Still, I felt a small sense of relief knowing I wasn't handling this alone anymore. At least now, someone was looking into it. Even after the call ended, I couldn't shake the fear. My mind replayed every moment: the circling car, the way he blocked my path, his hands never leaving his pockets. It all felt too close, too real. What would have happened if I hadn't locked my doors? If I hadn't trusted that uneasy feeling? The thought made my stomach churn. I sat in the car for a while, letting the tension drain from my body, but the fear lingered. The world outside the window felt different now, less familiar, less safe. I knew nothing physical had happened, but the sense of being targeted was enough to leave me shaken. I wasn't sure if I'd ever walk to my car at night the same way again. That night taught me something I'll never forget. Always trust your instincts. It's easy to brush off that uneasy feeling, to convince yourself you're overreacting, but sometimes it's the only warning you'll get. I realized how close I had come to something dangerous and how important it was to act on those instincts, no matter how small the situation might seem. From that point on, I promised myself to never take my safety for granted. It's better to seem paranoid than to take risks that could cost you everything. That man may be long gone, but the lesson he left behind will stay with me forever. Now, I always lock my doors, stay aware, and never ignore the voice inside that says something isn't right. After that night, I became more vigilant in every aspect of my life. Simple things, like parking under bright lights or checking my surroundings before getting out of the car, became habits I didn't question. I learned to prioritize my safety over politeness, to say no, and to trust my gut when something didn't feel right. The memory of the man and his unsettling actions stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can change. I used to think the world was mostly safe, but now I know better. It's not about living in fear, it's about being prepared, staying aware, and knowing that your instincts are there for a reason. That lesson, though hard to learn, is one I'll carry with me forever. As I walked through the parking lot, I noticed something else that didn't sit right. Two cars were parked nose to nose in an empty row, with a group of men standing between them. They were talking and laughing, their voices carrying across the otherwise silent lot. I glanced over quickly, trying not to make eye contact, and kept moving toward the store. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but I couldn't ignore the tension I felt. It wasn't unusual to see people hanging around late at night, but something about the way they stood there, so casual yet alert, made me uneasy. I brushed it off and hurried inside, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Inside the store, I focused on grabbing what I needed as quickly as possible. The aisles were almost empty, the silence broken only by the faint hum of overhead lights and the occasional squeak of a shopping cart. I moved fast, scanning my list and tossing items into my basket, trying to ignore the lingering unease from the parking lot. When I finally headed back outside, the air felt colder, heavier. As I approached my car, I noticed the same group of men. They weren't talking or laughing anymore. Instead, they were watching me. Their eyes followed every step I took, and the quiet of the lot only made it worse. I kept my head down, loaded my groceries into the trunk, and got into the driver's seat as quickly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. As soon as I started my car, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. The two cars with the men started their engines and pulled out of their spots, following me as I exited the parking lot. My stomach tightened, and I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a coincidence, I thought, but deep down, I knew better. I turned onto the main road, hoping they would go in a different direction. They didn't. Both cars stayed close behind me, their headlights glaring in my mirror. I told myself to focus, gripping the wheel tighter. My mind raced as I thought of what to do next. It wasn't just my imagination anymore, they were following me. I turned onto the freeway, hoping to lose them. The road was quiet, almost empty at this hour, and every move I made felt painfully obvious. I switched lanes, sped up, slowed down, anything to test if they were truly following me. But no matter what I did, they stayed right behind me, their cars moving in unison. Panic started creeping in, but I forced myself to think. I took an exit at the last second, hoping to throw them off, but they followed. I made random turns, weaving through empty streets, trying to shake them. Nothing worked. The more I tried to escape, the closer they seemed to get. It felt like a game to them, but to me, it was a nightmare. I knew I couldn't keep driving in circles forever, so I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was shaking as I explained the situation, giving them my location and describing the cars behind me. The dispatcher stayed calm, telling me to keep driving and not to stop until I felt safe. I kept making random turns, trying to buy time for the police to find me, but the cars didn't let up. Every corner I took, every street I turned onto, they followed. The dispatcher reassured me that help was on the way, but with each passing minute, the fear grew. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them catch up. I just had to keep moving. Realizing I couldn't wait for the police to find me, I made the only decision that felt safe. I drove straight to the police station. My heart was pounding as I sped toward the building, the bright blue sign glowing in the distance. I didn't care if it seemed drastic. I needed to end this now. As I neared the station, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the cars suddenly swerve away, taking a sharp turn down a side street. They must have realized where I was heading and didn't want to risk being caught. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a moment, my hands trembling on the wheel. For the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe again. But the fear hadn't completely faded. It was a close call I'd never forget. Sitting in the safety of the police station parking lot, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. Every turn, every glance in the mirror, every moment I felt their presence behind me, it all felt so vivid, like it had just happened. The dispatcher reassured me over the phone that I had done the right thing, but the lingering fear was hard to shake. I kept asking myself, what if I hadn't trusted my instincts? What if I had stopped somewhere quieter? The thought sent chills down my spine. I realized how quickly a situation could escalate and how important it was to act fast. That night, I learned a hard truth. Sometimes your only protection is your gut feeling and the actions you take to keep yourself safe. Even days after the incident, the fear stayed with me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, checking my surroundings, and avoiding empty parking lots at all costs. It wasn't just about being cautious anymore, it was about survival. That night had opened my eyes to how quickly things could go wrong. I realized how important it is to trust that gut feeling, the one that tells you when something isn't right. It's not being paranoid, it's being prepared. I may never know who those men were or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I'll never let my guard down like that again. Staying alert and acting quickly made all the difference, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The store was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars in the parking lot and dim lights glowing through the windows. As I walked inside, the air felt cooler than usual, almost like the store itself was holding its breath. I headed straight for the electronics section to find the floppy disks I needed. After grabbing what I came for, I decided to take my time. It wasn't often that I got to shop alone without distractions, so I wandered into the toy section. Christmas was just a few weeks away, and I thought it'd be a good time to get ideas for my son and nieces. The aisles were quiet, and I felt like I had the entire store to myself. But that peaceful feeling didn't last long. The store was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars in the parking lot and dim lights glowing through the windows. As I walked inside, the air felt cooler than usual, almost like the store itself was holding its breath. I headed straight for the electronics section to find the floppy disks I needed. After grabbing what I came for, I decided to take my time. It wasn't often that I got to shop alone without distractions, so I wandered into the toy section. Christmas was just a few weeks away, and I thought it'd be a good time to get ideas for my son and nieces. The aisles were quiet, and I felt like I had the entire store to myself. But that peaceful feeling didn't last long. As I stood in the toy aisle, looking at the shelves, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned my head and saw them. 3 men stood at the end of the aisle, their eyes fixed on me. They didn't move or say a word, just stood there, watching. There was something off about them. Their faces were pale, almost sickly, and their eyes were cold, unfeeling. What struck me most was their clothing, heavy coats buttoned up to their necks, completely out of place for the mild weather that night. A chill ran down my spine, but I quickly looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed. I tried to focus on the toys, but their presence had turned the quiet store into something much darker. I moved to another aisle, trying to shake the uneasy feeling, but it didn't work. When I glanced over my shoulder, they were there again, standing just far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to let me know they were watching. Every time I turned a corner, I saw them in my peripheral vision, lingering silently, never picking anything up or pretending to shop. My heart started to race. I told myself to stay calm, to act normal. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they weren't actually following me. But with each aisle I entered, their presence became harder to ignore. It was as if they were waiting for something, and I had no intention of finding out what that was. Deciding I had spent enough time in the store, I made my way toward the checkout. My stomach churned when I noticed the men standing near the entrance. They were huddled together, speaking in low voices, but their eyes kept dotting in my direction. I tried not to look at them, but the weight of their stares was impossible to ignore. I waited behind a couple at the register, using their presence as a buffer. As the cashier scanned their items, I pretended to be distracted, fiddling with my wallet and glancing around. The men stayed near the entrance, unmoving, as if they were waiting for me. My heart was pounding, but I focused on one thing: getting out safely. I wasn't leaving without a plan. When the couple finished checking out, I kept close behind them, using them as cover as we walked toward the exit. I stayed just a few steps ahead of them, pretending to adjust my bag, anything to not draw attention. The men by the door muttered something to each other as I passed, but I didn't stop to figure out what it was. The moment I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, and I quickened my pace toward my car. My heart sank when I saw their vehicle parked nose to nose with mine. It was no accident they had positioned themselves perfectly, waiting. Without hesitation, I got into my car, locked the doors, and tried to steady my breathing as I watched them from behind the wheel. I wasn't sure what they were planning, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The men didn't move, just stayed in their vehicle, watching me. For a moment, it felt like a standoff, neither of us making the first move. I took a deep breath, started the engine, and locked eyes with them through the windshield. They didn't flinch. As I slowly pulled out of my spot, their car started too. My chest tightened, but I stayed calm and drove out of the lot, pretending I hadn't noticed them following me. I made a turn toward my workplace, but decided not to head straight there. Instead, I passed it completely, determined to make sure they didn't know where I was going. My mind was racing, but I knew I had to stay one step ahead of them. I drove aimlessly for a while, taking random turns and circling through empty streets, keeping a close eye on my mirrors. When I was sure their car was no longer behind me, I pulled into a dark lot behind a strip mall and turned off my engine and lights. I sat in the silence, heart still racing, watching every vehicle that passed by. I needed to be certain I wasn't being followed. The thought of leading them back to my workplace or anywhere else familiar was unbearable. After several long minutes of nothing but stillness, my breathing finally began to slow. Only then did I feel safe enough to restart my car and head back to work, making sure to take a completely different route. Even though I was alone now, the fear hadn't completely left me. It was as if their presence still lingered, a shadow of what could have been. When I finally returned to work, the quiet office felt different, less like a safe space and more like a reminder of how close I had come to danger. I locked the door behind me and sat at my desk, still shaken. My size and preparedness had always made me feel safe before, but now I realized that even those couldn't guarantee protection. I kept thinking about their pale faces, their heavy coats, and the way they followed me without hesitation. It wasn't just unsettling, it was a warning. From that night on, I changed how I approached everything. Late night errands became a thing of the past, and I never again ignored the feeling of being watched. Trusting my instincts had saved me, and I knew I couldn't afford to let my guard down again. We grabbed a cart and started down the aisles, trying to stick to our usual routine. My mom and I always went through the store quickly, picking up the things we needed and trying to avoid the crowds. But tonight felt different. I couldn't stop noticing the group of men. They were still standing by the entrance, smoking and talking, but their eyes kept flicking to us every few seconds. As we moved deeper into the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following us. It was subtle at first, just the occasional glance. But the more we moved, the more I realized they were in every aisle we went to. They weren't making any effort to hide it. My mom didn't seem to notice yet, but I could feel my nerves starting to fray. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to find out what. I kept trying to act normal, but every time I looked over, they were there. One of the men was always just a few feet away, pretending to shop, but always watching. My mom noticed it too when one of the men got a little too close, standing right next to our cart in the cereal aisle. She shot him a look, but he just smiled, his eyes cold and unsettling. My heart started to race. I kept hoping we were just being paranoid, but it didn't feel like that. We tried to keep moving, but it felt like they were always right behind us. My mom grabbed my arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." I could tell she felt it too. The feeling of being watched had grown too strong to ignore. We quickly finished up our shopping and made our way to the self-checkout. I tried to focus on scanning the items, but every time I glanced up, I saw them standing in the next lane, watching us. They weren't pretending to shop anymore, they were just staring. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel their eyes on us, making everything feel suffocating. My mom was already on edge. her hands trembling slightly as she tried to finish the transaction. I could see the tension in her face, the worry. It was hard not to panic. I glanced at her, and she looked at me, silently saying what we both knew: we had to get out of there fast. But they weren't moving. The men just stood there, not bothering to act normal, making us feel trapped. As we finished checking out, I could feel the men getting closer. One of them, wearing a cap, moved right behind me, his presence making the air feel thick. His smile was disturbing, his teeth stained and crooked. I kept my eyes on the register, doing my best to ignore him, but it was impossible. My mom had already started calling my dad, trying to make sure we were safe. When she turned back to me, I saw the fear in her eyes. "We need to go," she whispered, pulling me toward customer service. I knew we couldn't leave without help, not with them still standing there, waiting. We moved quickly, hoping security would show up soon and that the men would leave. But they didn't. They stayed right there, watching, making sure we knew they were still there. When we reached customer service, the security guard stepped forward, his calm demeanor a relief. He asked for a description of the men, then walked to the front doors, scanning the area. My mom and I stayed close, watching as he spoke to the men outside. We waited, anxious, unsure of what would happen next. A few minutes later, the guard returned, telling us the men had been asked to leave. They were gone, but the fear lingered, and my mom's grip on my arm didn't loosen. We walked quickly to the car, feeling the weight of the night's tension lift slightly with every step. When we finally reached the safety of the car, I exhaled, but I knew we wouldn't forget what had happened. The experience had changed how we saw our surroundings, how quickly things could turn dangerous without warning. As we drove away from the store, the adrenaline slowly began to fade, but the unease remained. I kept replaying everything in my head: how the men had followed us, how their presence felt so deliberate and menacing. My mom didn't speak much, her hands gripping the steering wheel tight. The quiet between us said it all. That night changed how we looked at our safety. We'd always been cautious, but now we knew how quickly things could shift from ordinary to frightening. It wasn't just about trusting people around you, it was about being prepared for anything, listening to those gut feelings, and never ignoring them. As we drove home, I promised myself I'd never let my guard down again. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every time I walked into a store or parking lot, I found myself scanning my surroundings more carefully. I became hyper aware of the people around me, always wondering if someone was watching or following. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a necessary shift in how I moved through the world. I realized that sometimes, the only thing standing between safety and danger is the instinct to act quickly and decisively. That night taught me to trust myself, to recognize when something isn't right, and to never ignore the signs. I may never know what those men wanted, but I know I'll always be prepared to protect myself from whatever comes next. That night stuck with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can go from normal to terrifying. It wasn't just about being followed or feeling watched, it was about how easily the world can change. One moment, you're simply going about your life, and the next, you're questioning everything around you. From then on, I carried that awareness with me. I never went out at night without being extra cautious, and I never ignored that uneasy feeling in my stomach. The experience taught me to trust my instincts above all else. When something doesn't feel right, it's better to act fast and make sure you're safe than to risk finding out too late. That night changed how I viewed the world, and in a way, it made me stronger. We grabbed a cart and headed into the store. It was quiet inside, just a few people scattered across the aisles, shopping like it was any other night. My mom and I moved through the aisles, checking off items from the list, trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. But something felt off. I kept noticing a group of 5 men standing near the entrance, laughing and talking loudly. They seemed out of place, not because of what they were doing, but because of how they looked at us. Every time we passed, their eyes followed us. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't feel comfortable being there. It was like we were the only 2 people in the store, and they were watching our every move. As we moved deeper into the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that the men were following us. Every aisle we went down, I saw them again, lingering just a few steps behind. They didn't seem to be shopping. They just stood there, watching. I kept my head down, trying to act like everything was fine, but I could feel my heart rate picking up. My mom hadn't noticed yet, but I could tell she was starting to feel the tension. One of the men, a tall one with a scruffy beard, kept getting closer. He wasn't talking to anyone, just staring at us. I didn't want to make a scene, but I could feel the situation growing more uncomfortable by the second. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was wrong. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore the growing fear. As we continued shopping, the men seemed to close in on us. One of them, a lanky guy with messy hair, moved closer to our cart. He was standing just a few feet away, not doing anything, just staring. His eyes didn't leave us, and his smile felt wrong. My mom noticed the change in my behavior and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded, but inside, I was starting to panic. I kept glancing at the men, hoping they'd leave us alone, but they didn't. They stayed right where they were, watching us. The tension was unbearable, and I could feel it building with each second. We needed to leave, and fast. We decided to head to the self-checkout, hoping it would be quicker. But the moment we moved toward the lane, I saw them again. The same group of men, standing nearby, still watching. One of them, the guy with the cap, was standing so close to us that I could feel his presence looming behind me. I tried to stay calm, scanning the items as quickly as I could, but my hands were shaking. The men weren't making any effort to move away. They just stood there, staring. My mom kept glancing at me, her face tight with worry. We had to get out of there, but the men weren't leaving. It was like they were waiting for something to happen. As I finished scanning the last item, the guy in the cap stepped even closer, his smile twisted and uncomfortable. My mom grabbed my arm, her voice trembling as she said, "Let's go now." I could feel her panic, and mine was building too. We had to get out, but the men weren't making it easy. My mom quickly pulled out her phone and called my dad, her eyes darting between the men and the exit. She was trying to stay calm, but I could tell she was scared. I was too. The men weren't even pretending to shop anymore. They were blocking our way. I knew we needed help, and fast. We moved toward the customer service desk, hoping the security would notice us and intervene. My heart was racing as we walked past the men, who hadn't moved an inch. My mom's grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel the tension in the air. The men just stood there, their eyes fixed on us. At the customer service desk, a security guard immediately stepped in, asking us what was wrong. We gave him a quick description of the men, and he nodded, walking toward the entrance. A few moments later, he returned with the men in tow, telling us they had been escorted out of the store. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, but the relief didn't last long. The fear still lingered, and it was hard to shake the feeling that we were lucky to have gotten away unharmed. As we left the store, my mind was still racing. The relief of seeing the men escorted out barely touched the fear that had settled deep in my stomach. The walk to the car felt long, every shadow making me jump. I couldn't stop looking around, scanning the lot for any sign of the men returning. Once we were in the car, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. My mom didn't speak at first, but I could feel her tension too. We had both experienced something unsettling, and though we were safe now, the experience left us more aware of the dangers around us. That night taught me to never ignore that gut feeling when something doesn't feel right. It can make all the difference in staying safe. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Every time I stepped into a store or walked through a parking lot, I found myself checking every corner, every person. The sense of unease from that night lingered, reminding me how quickly things can go wrong. It made me realize that I had to be more aware, more cautious. I couldn't afford to ignore that feeling of being watched or followed. Even in a familiar place, something can shift in an instant, and the last thing I wanted was to be unprepared. The lesson was clear. Trust your instincts and always stay alert. It's not paranoia, it's just being safe.